Today's lesson is Lesson 6, Broad Stripes and Bright Stars. The vocabulary for this week, or for this lesson, first word is confident. This is an adjective, having a feeling or belief that you can do something. Example, the team ran on the field confident that they would win the game. Fort, a noun, a strong building or group of buildings where soldiers live. Example, the flag was flying outside the fort. A variation on that is forts. Inspired. This is a verb. To move a person to do something or think something, especially something creative. Example, Daniel was inspired by the president's speech. Some variations are inspire, inspires, or inspiring. Inspired is in your glossary, so let's jot down a definition for inspired, and then a quick sketch. Port, a noun. A coastal location that has a harbor in which ships can dock. Example, the ship's horn sounded so loudly as it moved out of the port. A variation on that is ports. This is another word that's in your glossary today. So go ahead and jot down a quick definition and a quick sketch of a coastal location that has a harbor in which ships can dock. Withdrew. This is a verb. To move away or back off from a particular place. Example, the king said goodnight to his guests and withdrew from the banquet hall. In the last read aloud, Britain attacked the capital, Washington, D.C. So what happened when the British attacked Washington, D.C.? Where did James Madison go? Did Dolly Madison stay in the president's house? What did Dolly Madison do when she learned that the British were coming? So our national anthem is a patriotic song. People sing a national anthem to show that they are proud of their country. Do you know the name of our national anthem? So in the United States, our national anthem is the Star-Spangled Banner. We sing it to show our pride in our country. We sing it before baseball games and other sporting events. We can sing it on holidays like the 4th of July. Sometimes we sing it at school. The words to this song were written by Francis Scott Key during the War of 1812. So today I want you to listen to this read aloud, Broad Stripes and Bright Stars, to learn more about the events that inspired Francis Scott Key to write the Star-Spangled Banner. What happened after the British left Washington? Asked Adele as she looked down at her grandfather from the highest hay bale. As you can imagine, Grandfather Lafitte replied, the British were feeling very confident. If they were confident, it means that they believed they could win. They had defeated the U.S. Army in Washington and destroyed the capital. They planned to capture Baltimore next, which at the time was a very important port. What is a port? Asked Adele. A port is a town or city where ships stop to load and unload cargo. Baltimore was a deep water port, meaning that the water was deep enough for really big ships to sail in and dock there. Baltimore was a port where ships could send and receive goods such as flour, tobacco, and sugar, explained Grandfather Lafitte. Besides that, Baltimore is a central location between New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, but for the British it would provide a place to land a huge invading army. So if the British destroyed the capital and then captured Baltimore, they would gain an advantage, said J.P. So an advantage is a position that helps make someone likely to succeed. And if you notice these pictures, these are all representative of cargo. So we've got some tea, there's some sugar, some flour, teacups. That's right, said Grandfather Lafitte. Capturing Baltimore was a key part of the British plan. From there they hoped to attack other important cities, but I will tell you what actually happened. The Battle of Baltimore can be divided into two parts, the battles on land and the battles at sea. The British general in charge of the attack on Washington, D.C. thought that they could capture Baltimore as easy as they did the capital. Oh boy, sighed J.P. These cats are interested in the story too. At that moment a second barn cat had come to join the first one. The second cat was attempting to sit on J.P.'s chest. That's not what happened, though, continued Grandfather Lafitte. The people of Baltimore knew that the British were coming and that they prepared themselves for a fight. The general of the U.S. Army ordered that huge earth banks called entrenchments be built along the eastern side of the city. They knew that the British soldiers would have to begin their attack there. Sure enough, one September morning, the British landed several thousand soldiers at a place called North Point. What is an entrenchment? Adele repeated the word she didn't understand as she dangled a long piece of string above a barn cat's head. Entrenchments were like trenches dug into the ground or sometimes walls built above the ground. The entrenchments acted as a defensive wall and a means of targeting the advancing army, explained Grandfather Lafitte. In addition to building the entrenchments, the army got ready to defend Fort McHenry. So this is an example of what an entrenchment looks like. Do you think building the entrenchments was a good idea? What was the purpose of Fort McHenry to protect Baltimore's harbor? Asked J.P. Yes, Fort McHenry was a defensive fort located right on the bay. So a fort is a strong building or group of buildings where soldiers live. And if you listen to port and fort, they both have the same ending sound. So it was built in the shape of a 5-pointed star. Soldiers were perched on the tip of each star point to protect the fort from all directions. The major knew that they had to try to keep the British soldiers out or they would surely lose. The British soldiers began to advance on the city. They kept coming until they were finally pushed back by a large U.S. army. So what does the army work to protect? You can see the large army. Did the British give up? Asked J.P. Not yet, replied Grandfather Lafitte. They withdrew, or pulled back, and set up camp. The next morning the battle continued. The British marched right up to the entrenchments at North Point. This time they didn't just face a larger U.S. army, but lots of cannons and other weapons too. The British quickly realized that they were outgunned. They retreated, and we won the Battle of North Point. But what happened at Fort McHenry? Asked Adele. That's quite a story, said Grandfather Lafitte as he laughed quietly. The people of Baltimore had imagined that they were in for a long, hard fight, and so they prepared for one. Besides building entrenchments, they stored supplies. They even sank some of their own ships so that the British would not be able to sail into the harbor. They sank their own ships? Asked J.P. astonished. Yes, they did, explained Grandfather Lafitte. Another important part of the preparation included the creation of a new flag for Fort McHenry. The commander of the fort, Major George Armistead, wanted a flag so big that the British sailors would be able to see it from far away. A lady named Mary Pickersgill was asked to make the flag. Why do you think the commander of the Fort McHenry wanted the British to be able to see the flag from far away? I read a book about this once, said Adele. Mary Pickersgill needed help to make such a big flag. She did indeed, replied Grandfather Lafitte. Her daughter, her 2 nieces, and a young apprentice helped. The flag that these 5 women made had 15 stars and 15 stripes. When it was finished, the flag was as large as a house. It was actually bigger than the room they were making it in. Mary Pickersgill's flag measured 30 feet tall by 42 feet wide. It was carried to the fort and would later be hung on a giant flagpole. Do you know how many stars and stripes our flag has today? There are 13 stripes and 50 stars, J.P. said confidently. The 13 stripes represent the 13 original colonies, and the stars represent our 50 states. Excellent, exclaimed Grandfather Lafitte. Now let's get back to the story. Before long, the British began firing rockets at Fort McHenry. At first, the British ships were too far from the fort for the U.S. soldiers to be able to return fire. For more than 24 hours, the British pounded the fort. 24 hours is one whole day and one whole night. With little return fire, the British ships sailed closer and closer to the fort. Once they were close enough, though, our soldiers were able to return fire. That must have sounded like a terrible thunderstorm, said Adele. Probably louder than fireworks on the 4th of July, added J.P. Did we hit any British ships? Asked J.P. We sure did, said Grandfather Lafitte. In fact, the British ships were forced to pull back. They kept firing, though. However, early the next morning, the British realized that they had not been able to take over the city. They stopped the attack, and the British ships sailed away. During the night, the fort had flown a smaller flag, but as the British stopped firing and prepared to sail away, General Armistead directed the army to raise the enormous flag that Mary Pickersgill and her helpers made. How do you think the soldiers in the fort felt as they raised this flag? Wow! Exclaimed J.P. and Adele together. Grandfather added, a man named Francis Scott Key watched the whole battle that night from a boat just outside in the Baltimore harbor. He saw bombs shooting through the air and watched the rockets rain down all through the day and into the night. As the sun came up, Francis Scott Key was still on the boat. When he saw that enormous flag flying, he knew that Baltimore had been saved. The United States had won the battle. Francis Scott Key wrote our national anthem, exclaimed J.P. That's right. The events that morning inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that later became our national anthem, added Grandfather Lafitte. Inspired means that something had a particular cause or influence. Come on, JP, announced Adele. Let's sing the national anthem for Granddad. The two children stood up in the warm sunshine and looked at their grandfather. Together they sang the words that Francis Scott Key was inspired to write that morning so long ago. When the children were finished, Grandfather Lafitte smiled proudly at them. With his arms around their shoulders, he said, "Why don't we head back up to the house for a late afternoon snack? You might even hear something about those pirates, too." "Sounds good to me," said Adele as she scrambled down from the hay bales. The word scrambled means to hurry over something quickly, often also using your hands. Scrambled also refers to a way to cook eggs. "Ooh, pirates!" exclaimed JP. Then together the three walked back toward the house with their two furry friends at their heels. What did the people of Baltimore and the army do to prepare for the British? What was Mary Pickersgill asked to make? Why did the British want to capture the city of Baltimore? Why was it important that Baltimore was a deep water port? Why did the commander of Fort McHenry want such a large flag? Why didn't the soldiers in the fort fire back at the British for a long time? What did Francis Scott Key see that inspired him to write the Star-Spangled Banner? In today's read aloud, you heard, the events at Fort McHenry inspired Francis Scott Key to write a poem that later became our national anthem. Say the word inspired with me. Inspired. The word inspired means to move something. The word inspired means to move someone to do something or to think something, especially something creative. My first grade teacher inspired me to want to be a teacher. Can you think of someone in history or from today or someone you know who has inspired you? What's the word we've been talking about? Inspired.